morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us this morning. My name is Julia Dolan. I am the Minor White Curator of Photography, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the Portland Art Museum for this celebration of Minor White and his early career, and the photographs that form the foundation of this museum's photography collection. I am grateful to our distinguished speakers who have come from all over the country, as well as from around the corner, to share their ideas about White's beginnings with us today. And I am particularly thankful to Kate Boussard, the Peter C. Bunnell Curator of Photography at the Princeton University Art Museum, and one of the stewards of the Minor White Archive at Princeton, who first suggested that we host a symposium and who has co-organized the event with me. We are appreciative of the support received from the Minor White Archive and the Princeton University Art Museum, which allows for this event to be free and open to the public. In addition to those present today in the Witzel Auditorium at the museum, we are live streaming this event on our YouTube channel. We welcome all those who are watching from afar, and we invite you to participate by asking questions. They can be submitted through YouTube if you have a Google account. After each talk, we do expect to have time to take questions or comments from the audience, so that everyone in the auditorium, as well as those watching online, can hear your question. Please wait for us to give you a microphone. While we hope that you are able to join us for the entire event, we realize that it is quite a full day, so do feel free to come and go as necessary. We also hope that you will be able to spend some time in the current exhibition, In the Beginning, Minor White's Oregon Photographs, which is located on level 2M of our Jubit Center for Modern and Contemporary Art. When leaving the auditorium, you can simply turn left and take the elevator or the stairs to level 2M. For those of you who are not in Portland, you can visit our website, portlandartmuseum.org. Click on the Exhibitions tab at the top of the page, and under Current Exhibitions, a link to In the Beginning will allow you to see all of the prints included in the current exhibition. A reminder that In the Beginning will refresh in early May. The current selection of prints is on view through Sunday, May 6th, and a second set of White's Oregon photographs will open to the public on Saturday, May 12th. The reason for this two-part exhibition is quite simple. I couldn't bring myself to eliminate more than a few of White's WPA photographs from my checklist. They are all exceptional, and the only ones I could cut were those that are in need of some conservation, which amounted to approximately 5 prints or so. In addition, I didn't want to shove too many photographs into a space that couldn't properly hold them all at one time, so here we are with a second Minor White exhibition scheduled. So I'm going to switch over to my talk, and I'm not sure if I need help from Tim to do that. Let's see if I can make it work. It worked. I'm going to start off today's events with a talk about the importance of Minor White's early work at the Portland Art Museum, as well as his continuing connections to the museum years after leaving Oregon. I will extend beyond his WPA photographs, so this title may be a bit misleading. For those of you who have heard me speak before, I normally don't read my papers, but in the interest of staying within time boundaries and in an effort to be as accurate as possible, I'll be reading this time. There is quite a concentration of Minor White experts here today, even individuals that perhaps knew him personally, and I don't want to wander away from the facts or from Minor's history. I do welcome any corrections from those who know more about this time period in White's career than I do. Because my position is titled the Minor White Curator of Photography, I am frequently asked what Minor White has to do with Portland. While he is a renowned figure in the history of modernist American photography, his photographic beginnings in Oregon are often minimized or overlooked, and are, in many respects, almost completely unknown, especially when compared to the attention he continues to receive for his later work in Rochester and at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, or for Aperture, and even to an extent for his later 1940s and early 1950s work in California. The current exhibition and this symposium aim to change that. Although most of us have come to know Minor White through the symbolic, metaphoric photographs he created during his mid and later career phases, his early photographic practice was rooted in the complex realities of the 1930s and the 1940s, such as the growing pains of a riverside city rushing to modernize, a country struggling to emerge from economic devastation, and international forces that would soon pull the country and White himself into war. In these early works, we can find glimmers of White's later photographic practice, but we would be unwise to look past the value of White's first photographic phase and its continuing resonance in our effort to grasp the energy and intention of the later work. It is equally important to recognize his sustained fondness for this region and its photographers, as well as his continuing influence on today's artists working nearby. The two-phase exhibition in the beginning, Minor White's Oregon Photographs, which, as I just mentioned, will reset with a new group of prints in about 3 weeks' time and continue through October of this year, honors the Portland Art Museum's 125th anniversary and its photography collection, which was more formally established in 1942 with the permanent loan of White's photographs. This permanent loan is a rather unusual arrangement that I will explain more thoroughly in a few moments. Minor White arrived in Portland from Minnesota in the late spring of 1937, around his 29th birthday, with a newly acquired Argus C3 35mm camera and very little cash. He moved into the YMCA, worked as a night clerk at the Beverly Hotel, and joined the Oregon Camera Club, mostly to have access to their technical knowledge, library resources, and their darkroom, as his aesthetics never quite matched their more conservative pictorial visual leanings. By 1938, he had installed a darkroom and began an education and exhibition program at the YMCA, and after brief stints photographing for a housing improvement rights group at Reed College, the People's Power League as well, and even Bonneville's Rod and Gun Club newsletter, he was hired to be a creative photographer for the Oregon Art Project, a subsidiary of the Federal Works Progress Administration, which was one of the major governmental programs that provided funds and often meaningful work for some of the many millions of individuals severely affected by the Great Depression. Indeed, various arms of the Works Progress Administration, or WPA, employed 8.5 million people during its 8 years of existence. Under its auspices, communities throughout the nation received funds to build public buildings, as well as roads and other types of critical infrastructure. But the administration did not leave artists or their valuable skills behind. It also established Federal Project Number 1, which was championed by Eleanor Roosevelt and oversaw the Federal Art Project, the Federal Music Project, the Federal Theater Project, the Federal Writers Project, and the Historical Records Survey. All of these arms of the WPA created financial relief and allowed various branches of the arts to survive and sometimes even thrive during the worst economic downturn in the country's history. I will leave it to my colleagues to discuss the nature and meaning of White's early photographs, but his work for the WPA, primarily produced in 1938 and 1939 and a bit into the 1940s as well, and largely focused on the city's waterfront buildings being readied for clearing for parking lots and a new street system. And his striking images of the city's critical waterfront industry became a cornerstone of this museum's photography collection, which now numbers close to 10,000 works. In 1942, as war programs ramped up and Depression-era programs such as the WPA wound down, the federal government, faced with an overabundance of artwork produced through its programs, placed prints, posters, sculptures, paintings, and photographs with institutions nationwide that held connections to the work's makers and regions. After they had been exhibited in various government-supported art centers, 76 of White's photographs, arriving in 2 groups in mid-1942, were placed on permanent loan here at the Portland Art Museum. 2 of the first batch are on the screen right here. And this is a partial list of that group from our register's files, and this document dates to June 25th of 1942. A number of the images listed here are currently on view upstairs. Two of the images from the second group, which I showed earlier, are demonstrated here. And an additional permanent loan of 10 of White's images of Eastern Oregon arrived later that year. In 1943, a final group of photographs was placed with the museum, bringing the total WPA-supported works by White to 107. These pictures form the original core of the museum's current photography holdings. Although photographs were regularly exhibited at the museum from 1905 onward, often in annual exhibitions of work by members of the Oregon Camera Club, the same camera club that was helpful to, but not philosophically aligned with, White, and the museum's library possessed photographs, including Edward Curtis's 20-volume set, The North American Indian, the medium was first treated as at least somewhat equal to painting, sculpture, and prints, with the permanent loan of White's Oregon photographs in 1942, about 45 years after the institution began accessioning other forms of art. And lest you think that the government has perhaps lost track of its belongings, the General Services Administration checks in quite regularly with us about our entire collection of WPA-related artworks. This loan agreement demonstrates the typical 3-year renewal cycle. This is only a part of the loan agreement, the full loan agreement. And to answer a question that may arise, and often does arise, no, I do not believe that the government will take these away from us anytime soon. At least I hope they don't. White's prints produced for the WPA that toured art centers for about 2 to 3 years before returning to Oregon and arriving at the museum were not the only manifestations of his efforts in Oregon. His archival holdings, which we will discuss further in today's third session, offer evidence of many underemphasized or forgotten aspects of White's time in Oregon, as well as the threads that continued to tie him to the region into the 1960s. WPA negatives that arrived at the museum from parts unknown sometime in the 1950s, and unfortunately the details of their arrival remain murky to this day, demonstrate later work that White did for the WPA in Portland and in Eastern Oregon. In early 1940, he photographed a number of artists making work through the WPA's Fine Arts program, including the painting of a mural in the library of Abernathy School, a Portland public school located in Ladd's Addition, which is still part of the school system and is located just 2 or so miles from here. Indeed, these negatives have been used to research the history of the mural, which has been painted over at least 5 times since the 1950s. The original library is now a classroom, and to promote efforts to fund the full restoration of the mural, which it seems has been more than successful. And if you Google Abernathy School mural and the artist's name, information does quite readily come up. And you'll notice at the bottom information that the school received a 2017 Heritage Commission grant, so just a few months ago, that will allow for the cleaning and restoration of the original mural. What I do find interesting is when I look online and find Miner's photographs of this mural that directly relate to his work. You see the one in the top left over here. None of them are credited. So that's something that would be great to potentially correct. In mid-1940, still working for the WPA, White relocated to far northeastern Oregon to teach for and eventually manage the Grand Ronde Valley Art Center in La Grande. While teaching his own photography classes 3 nights a week and running the facility, he also documented the many activities of the government-supported Arts Center, including children's art classes, theater, teas, and even fundraising art auctions. In late 1941, as the nation's economic crisis eased and the war machine engaged, White left his WPA position, returning to Portland with the general aim of establishing a commercial photography practice. The Portland Art Museum, already aware of his work, exhibited his photographs of Eastern Oregon in February of 1942, the same year it commissioned him to photograph 2 nearby historic houses, with the trustees' blessing and the quote, "Are you satisfied with the pics of the 2 houses? They were made so rapidly that I find I only have a hazy idea of them left. Hope Grant is not having too much trouble with them. Also hope a good set of prints is arrived at." Davis replied that Grant, an employee at the museum and one of the few not called to war, had, quote, "quite a job remaking a few of the prints and mounting them all," unquote. But that the show of the photographs was to open that very day, July 3rd. In that same letter, Davis explains to White that the Oregon Art Project offices recently closed and that many of White's photographs stored there had been placed at the museum. A selection of White's Dolph and Lindley House photographs, the homes were torn down in 1942 and 1951 respectively, went on view at the museum again in the summer of 1950. Like many of the waterfront buildings White photographed for the WPA, the houses were by then seen as unpleasant relics of a bygone era. The introductory text for the 1950 exhibition, written by an unknown author, stated, quote, "Few people think of the second half of the 19th century in America as one of this country's great eras. It is usually considered a somber and generally mediocre era," unquote. The text later continued that wealthy Americans' homes of the period were not marked by good taste or selectivity and, quote, "since the people of means had more money than could be spent sensibly, they spent it carelessly. But in spite of the general tendency to ridicule the houses of this period, these photographs reveal a craftsmanship and attention to detail not often found today," unquote. There was no mention of White in this document. White's house photographs of 1942 were not his final connection to director Robert Tyler Davis or the Portland Art Museum. After the war, while studying at Columbia University and spending time with Beaumont and Nancy Newhall at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, White endeavored to return to Portland, hoping that the Portland Art Museum would establish a photography instruction and exhibition program at its school. The original letters between White and Davis, which are on view in the exhibition upstairs, suggest White's enthusiasm and Davis's reticence to follow through with such an endeavor at that time. In January 1946, White wrote a detailed outline of the potential program, which was based on MoMA's own newly founded photography center. In late March, Director Davis replied to White, writing, quote, "The situation here is still very vague. The school is terribly crowded as we have a daytime registration of 20 students, mostly full-time, and an evening registration of over 225. There is talk right now of raising money to build a new wing, but this will not come off for several years. I hope you will go through with your plan to come back here eventually, but I should say that a couple years of the kind of work you are doing would be all to the good, and the project here would probably be that much stronger for being postponed a year or two," unquote. Just a few months later, Ansel Adams hired White to teach at the California School of Fine Arts. He remained there until late 1953, when he relocated to Rochester to work with Beaumont Newhall at George Eastman House, later joining the faculty of the Rochester Institute of Technology. You can imagine my feelings on this. Happy for California and New York and Massachusetts, but sad for us. And yet, the pull of Portland, often emanating from the Portland Art Museum, kept tugging at White. He returned briefly in early 1951, along with Ansel Adams and J. Walter Thompson's art director Renee Weaver, to jury a photography exhibition for the museum. Corresponding documents are on view now in the exhibition upstairs. According to an Oregon Journal newspaper article documenting the jurying, over-enlargement of prints was frowned upon by all 3 jurors, and Ansel Adams felt that, quote, "Oregon photographers should do better printing," unquote. A highly skilled printer of black and white photographs, as you probably know, Adams' judgment is severe but not surprising. In 1959, White, now regularly working in a metaphoric vein, was invited back to Portland in conjunction with the state of Oregon's centennial celebrations. Sequence 13 returned to the Bud, a major exhibition of more than 100 of his photographs that had first shown at George Eastman House, was exhibited in the Centennial Exhibition Building, both intriguing and perplexing Oregonian writer Harold Hughes, who wrote that the work was pretty far out. White also worked through the museum school that summer, teaching a centennial workshop from July 20th through the 29th. His course was exceedingly popular, eventually pushing a group of 15 acolytes to establish a long-distance critique group with White, and he was invited to return to Oregon to teach in 1960. Here is a brochure explaining that. And he was invited back again in 1961 and 1962, all the way through 1966. And in these wonderful documents from the Princeton archive, you can see the connections that continued between the Museum Art School and White over time. The workshops were meaningful not only to his avid students, but to White as well, who regularly wrote about his love and delight for the work. In an August 59 letter to Beaumont and Nancy Newhall, he wrote, "I cannot define what happened, but one of the participants said, 'I joined the workshop to learn about photography and am finding out how to live.'" White continued, quote, The photographs turned out in the last shooting have a song in them," unquote. In this 1962 postcard to his mother in Minnesota, shown on the left, White writes that his just completed Portland workshop was a very rewarding experience and that he is on his way to the coast for the old-timers, who were his regular attendees, many of whom would become part of the aforementioned long-distance interim critique group. In a July 1960 letter written to the Newhalls during that year's Portland workshop, White explained of his students, quote, "The range and scope of the 40 members of the beginning workshop is amazing. One urologist, or penis machinist, one radiologist," his words, not mine, "one radiologist, one state senator, one lawyer, several school teachers, a travel agent, and a number of people who are running their first roll of film through their first camera at the age of 89. I don't know how they do it, but they seem to get something from us." Some of White's repeat students and members of the interim group for whom he critiqued remotely, mostly men, but not all, are now part of the museum's permanent collection and include, but are not limited to, Edwin Dolan, of no relation, and Bill Galen, who still lives here in town and visits the museum regularly. And his photograph is up on the wall with White in the exhibition, in a photograph by an unknown artist. Also, L.K. Andrews and Maxwell Alera. Maxwell Alera's son is here with us today. And also images by Arnold Rustin and Ray Wing. And I believe that Ray's daughter is here with us today. Hi, Sharon. So many connections. In conclusion, I hope this brief and nowhere near thorough enough overview of Minor White's early professional years in Portland and his continuing ties to the region, this museum, and area photographers demonstrates the importance of studying his full career, particularly through the objects he left behind, his photographs and archival materials. I will leave you with words from Minor himself about his time in Oregon, from a postcard he wrote to his mother on July 16, 1959, just before beginning his first centennial workshop. It is now in Princeton's archive. Made it to Portland last night about 10, in superb condition, feeling better than ever. Sun and wind and mosquitoes, hot, dry days, cool nights, bathing in mountain streams, the Columbia River is stimulating. The things seen and photographed have been magnificent, the finest trip I have ever made. And the work here promises to be a continuation of stimulation. Love, Minor. Thank you. As is unusual in events like these, we are absolutely perfectly on time and perhaps even a little bit early. So we certainly do have time for questions, and I know that I will be looking to John if there are any questions that come through YouTube. Apparently there are no questions through YouTube. Not yet. They might come in. And we do have time for questions later as well, but if anyone has any questions at this time, please do feel free to ask. Charles will bring a microphone to you so that everyone can hear your question. I explained it all. No questions. No? Okay. That's fine. I imagine that questions, well, it's a little early still. I know. It's early for us in Portland. I imagine that there will be questions as the day proceeds, so we'll be more than happy to take those. Oh, we do have one question, Stephen, and Charles will be by with the microphone. Just one moment.
Julia, the WPA photographs that are in the collection, or that are on the loan from the government, are prints.
Yes.
Do the negatives for those continue to exist, and are other sets of the prints collected, and if so, at what institution?
So I believe there are people who have more information on that than I do, and Ken Hawkins is one. Many of the negatives are over at the Oregon Historical Society, and we'll talk about that later. We do not have the negatives from those images for the most part. We have the later images that he made, primarily in Eastern Oregon. There are images, vintage prints from these groups that are in different places. I know the Princeton University Archive has some in the collection there. There are about 30 of them at the Multnomah County Library right down the street, and so you can actually go to the rare books room and have a look at those as well. Some of those were duplicates when the groupings were sent to us. Some remained behind at the library or were given to the library because some of them were in fact duplicates. And then I believe Oregon Historical Society has some as well. And then some have made their way into various collections. Very rarely we'll see them come up at different places. It's not something I'm fully apprised of in terms of who has how many where. I would hesitate to say that we have the largest collection of them because I'm not positive about that. I would like to think that we do and hope that we do, because it's a nice thing to be known for, certainly. And because those groupings were used for such a number of years and moved around to different art centers and used as exhibitions for people to visit, they were all together, which was great. So then when the government dispersed them, they mostly came together to us. So for us to have a larger grouping of them would certainly make sense. But I will be happy as we go on, if anybody has any further information, we can answer that question further. Yes. The microphone will be coming if you don't mind waiting just a second. Thanks, Charles.
Thank you. You mentioned his correspondence with the Newhalls. Is that part of a larger social group of friends of his? I'm not familiar with who they are.
I apologize, I should have filled that in. So Beaumont and Nancy Newhall. Beaumont was one of the first early curators at the Museum of Modern Art in photography. And right at the time that Miner was getting to know him, Edward Steichen was returning for more and moving into the chair position of the photography department there. So you actually do see some friction in some of the letters going back and forth because Beaumont and Edward Steichen, also a massive important name in the history of photography, they did not get along so well. So Beaumont eventually, and Beaumont Newhall was a photographer as well, and you will occasionally see some of his photographs out and about. He eventually went to the George Eastman House in Rochester, and so Miner, a number of years later, after stopping off in California and working with Ansel Adams for a number of years, through Beaumont goes on along to to Rochester to be with Beaumont and his wife Nancy. And I had just visited this last week, the Princeton Museum archives, the Minor White archives there, and the wealth of information there is incredible. We have limited information about Minor's time. Fortunately, Minor kept so many of his records and his letters and his postcards to his mother and his friends. So there is an incredible amount of information to be mined there. And most of the information about things like the Group 15 and the interim group, which was this group that I had mentioned of people in Portland who would send their photographs in a tape recorder to Minor in Rochester. He would look at the photographs and he would record his thoughts and opinions about the works and then send the tape recorder and the tape back to Portland with the photographs, and the group would get together because they missed him when he wasn't here teaching his workshops during the rest of the year. All of that information Minor kept, and I haven't seen that information here in Portland before. So I was able to take a look through all of it, and I'm still kind of going through and determining who did what in the interim group or with Group 15. So it's an incredible, incredible resource that Princeton now has, and we're so fortunate that they were able to save it and keep it for future reference and use. Thank you so much, everyone. I am going to move us along just a little bit early then, but it might take me a second to set up. Our next speaker's slide deck. It's my great pleasure to introduce Ian Borland. Ian is a critic of global contemporary art and historian of photography, and is currently assistant professor at the Maryland Institute College of Art, my alma mater, but will be joining the faculty of Georgetown University in the fall. Many congratulations, Ian. And I have Brendan's up. I apologize. I saw Charles running up, and I realized that I have the wrong one up. What am I doing? Is it? There we go. End show. See, this is why I need Charles. Thank you.
Ready? I think that's ready.
So once you play it.
I don't think I want to play it.
There we go. Yeah. Good.
I think that'll work.
Good. Thank you. I was wondering why everybody was murmuring. Now I know. Thank you so much, Charles, and apologies to everyone. So let's try that again, because this is really wonderful. Ian is currently at the Maryland Institute College of Art, but is joining the faculty of Georgetown University in the fall. Congratulations. His first monograph on Afro-British photographer Rotimi Fani Kayode will be published by Duke University Press this winter. This talk builds on research supported by a Minor White Archive grant at Princeton and is part of his next project on the critical potential of landscape photography. Please join me in welcoming Ian Borland. Sorry about that. Yes.
Bear with me, I'm a little tall. It's a fun comparison here. All right. If you can't hear me, I can adjust this a little more too. So first I want to say thank you to Julia and Charles and the team here for organizing this wonderful event and for bringing us out from the dreary East Coast to be in beautiful Portland today. And I want to take this moment too to thank Kate and everyone at the Princeton University Art Museum, not only for the aforementioned grant and for sponsoring today's events, but also for fostering this new, exciting conversation emerging around Miner's work over the last several years. So I'm very excited to see where it all goes. All right. So this image has nothing to do with Miner White, seemingly. This is where I spend a lot of my summers. This is up for a few reasons. You can see what's happening here. This is Table Mountain framed. This is where you're supposed to take the photograph. And so there are thousands of these circulating on the internet. So this is partially to just show you that my work is mostly contemporary, often centered around Africa and other sort of global sites. And so my work on Miner kind of is happening laterally. And this is also kind of a learning process for me right out of the archive. So if people want to offer corrections or to help me as I develop this paper, I'd love to have that conversation after or later in the day. Also, I want to use this image to kind of shorthand what I'm doing in today's paper, which is to locate White in a history of image making that we might call the picturesque, and it's a larger process that we might think of as the picturesque unconscious, something that we all do and will continue to do, I think, knowingly or unknowingly as we take pictures of each other and of the world. And I think this is where White enters a kind of history that also bears on the colonial history of the Western United States as well. All right. I too am going to read for precision's sake. In 1995, the photographer Fred Hill sent a letter to curator Peter Bonnell, following up on an earlier correspondence about a local camera club that had briefly sought to restage a photograph that Miner White had taken some 50 years prior from the high prospect of Mount Emily, looking out at the valleys of eastern Oregon. Hill himself had recently published an article in the journal History of Photography, recalling the 7 years when his life intertwined with White's, from the evening camera class that took him and his mother, Lynn Hill, whom White referred to lovingly as Ma, took White as part of the WPA extension program in La Grande to the summer of 1947, when Hill left the CSFA and moved to become a technical photographer in Oakland. During that time, White periodically needled Hill from the 1940 Christmas gift he sent, a copy of Morgan and Lester's Graphic Graflex Photography, simply inscribed, quote, "in hopes of improving your lousy technique," end quote, to a 1948 letter mailed from San Francisco to Lynn Hill, by then his surrogate mother, claiming he had no address for his old friend, who had simply moved across the bay. The two men proved pivotal in each other's lives, however. As the new teacher of photography at CSFA, referred by Beaumont Newhall from New York to work alongside Adams, White sent a terse telegraph informing Hill that a place had opened for him in that year's cohort, just as the semester began. Hill promptly moved his young family and their mobile home from Tacoma, Washington, parking it in front of 129 24th Avenue near the Presidio in San Francisco, Ansel Adams' own house, where White had taken up residence. Perhaps White was returning the favor to Hill, who seems to have taken him in during the years of 1940 and 1941, when visits to Portland were infrequent and White was marooned without a car. Hill did have a car, and he recalls taking drives with White to make photographs in the surrounding Blue Mountains and Willowa Range, and the low-lying farm country in between. It must have been quite a sight for the young Minnesotan, the quintessentially western high desert terrain, the alpine cirques and lakes that rose thousands of feet from the settlements below. This region marks the course of the Snake River and the path of Lewis and Clark to the terminus of the lower 48. It was a perfect place for White to test the photographic theories he had been reading about in the library back in Portland, essays by John Paul Edwards and Ansel Adams in the pages of Cameracraft. So this talk centers on the landscape photographs that White made during these years exploring the Oregon countryside with the Hill family. While White would continue to shoot landscapes, from city streets to the fields of upstate New York to the subtle topographics of his abstract hibernal interiors, he would only rarely make images in the American West again, especially in this register. These little discussed images are nonetheless crucial, and they mark a turning point in his formation as a self-taught photographer, honing his technique in remote dialogue with the leaders of American creative photography during the late 1930s and early 1940s, Alfred Stieglitz and Berenice Abbott on the East Coast, and the F-64 group in the West. Indeed, one of Hill's first contributions upon his arrival in the fall of 1946 to San Francisco was to take a negative from one of those late summer trips in 1940, the one up here on the screen. Hill would enlarge it using equipment Ansel Adams' own, found in the basement of that house on 24th Street. This was a valediction of sorts, marking the end of White's time in the wilderness and a consummation of his arrival among the photographic elite. As is well known, Minor White lived in Oregon until 1942, when he shipped off on an Army troop carrier to San Francisco, a reluctant GI who had just completed an unexpectedly successful second five-year plan. The first had been a mastery of poetic verse, to be followed by picking up the rudiments of photography. In those days, this was an act of pilgrimage and autodidacticism, of reading journals, taking field trips with camera clubs, and corresponding with the then small circles of creative photographers during the long hangover of pictorialism. This second phase had gone better than White could have initially hoped, owing in no small part to his engagement as a teacher with the WPA, and from his initial perch as an instructor at the YMCA, living in the Portland Tenderloin and taking on periodic commissions to photograph a rapidly changing city, he was dispatched in 1940 to the northeastern part of the state, that remote stretch of present-day I-84. LeGrand was then, as is now, a small rural town built on the Oregon Trail, then the railroad, gold mining, the university, and finally a sugar factory. But for White, like Edward Muybridge and Ansel Adams before him, it also provided a base camp to test the theories of the group F-64. In Portland, that meant Abbott, who was already a well-known New York photographer of urban life and a proponent of the haunting, depopulated Parisian streetscapes of Eugene Atget. But more generally, in his unpublished diary, Memorable Fancies, White writes of LeGrand in 1984, noting that he, quote, greedily devoured all the books on photography in the Portland Public Library. Now I am gathering all the images I can in Eastern Oregon. Edward Weston and the F-64 group still dominate. A philosophy of straight photography is now being put to the test. By this, he meant the refinement of creative photography in the years after World War I, towards greater precision and medium specificity, and away from the pictorial effects and sentimental darkroom manipulations that had long prevailed. Back east, this was the realism and high gloss of Abbott and Stieglitz, and in Oregon, the gospel of Group F-64, which articulated a theory of straight photography rooted in the American West. The group, consisting of an affiliation of photographers, gallerists, students, and assistants based around the Bay Area, came together in 1932 with a show at the DeYoung Museum. They used exhibitions and magazines to circulate their vision in the years that followed. In practice, this meant using larger format cameras, 4x5s or, when possible, 8x10s, to capture exquisite detail and tonal range, a withdrawal from narrative or realist modes into a space of formalism that ranged from the symbolic to the abstract, and especially in the reckoning of Edward Weston, an emphasis on pre-visualization, on seeing photographically in advance of the shot rather than cropping and processing after the fact. Weston's was a discipline bordering on Jedi mysticism, and that appealed to the young White, who later became known for assiduous control of his output, and later a near monastic existence predicated on cycles of repression and sublimation. And White would have known the general contours of F-64 and its insistence on small aperture and uniform focal range. He explicitly cites, at this time, Weston's first book, previously on the screen, organized by Merle Armitage in 1932, and featuring the carefully lighted, tightly focused still life for which Weston became known after his years in Mexico. Weston's second book included his iconic Monterey cypress trees, alongside a veritable how-to, from theory to technical procedure, of his method. White also cites the Cameracraft essay on F-64, which presumably included Willard Van Dyke's 1933 and John Paul Edwards' overviews of the group's history, roster, and priorities, as well as Ansel Adams' 1935 publication and description of his winter photographs at Yosemite National Park in the Sierra Nevada. In short, Van Dyke's summation of F-64's approach from 1932 onward amounted to an insistence on formalism over aesthetics, indeed a kind of anti-aesthetic, if we assume that aesthetics refers to the long-standing attempt by artists to rationalize the viewer response to certain genres of form, especially around the idea of beauty. By contrast, and echoing the contemporaneous writing of Laszlo Moholy-Nagy and Paul Strand, Van Dyke and Weston in California posited a break with conventional aesthetics, seeking instead a new modern language with its own specific syntax, usage, and visual manifestation. Such a prescription was detailed, as it were, down to the millimeter, and it was this prescription that White was putting to the test in Oregon. Of course, even for F64, there was still an admission of beauty. A break from the pictorial, hence the artifice of painting, was hedged in texts like Fernand Léger's Aesthetic of the Machine and Paul Strand's Photography and the New God, as not altogether doing away with beauty, but instead locating it in a way that was native to the machinic age, with the camera as its messenger, elevating even the most banal with exquisite tonality, with its optical unconscious, and in Walter Benjamin's terms, a form that exceeded mere human perception. Hence Henry Swift's high contrast mathematical forms, Imogen Cunningham's texturally rich plants, Edward's carefully framed harbor studies, and of course, Edward Weston's shells, fruits, and still life of his beloved California coast. For his part, Minor White tried on several variants of the F64 approach. In Grand Ronde, he tried his hand at the hard Scrabble FSA-style documentary seen in the work of the affiliated Dorothea Lange, alongside the more Abbott-Atjeh-inspired works in Portland that Julia just showed us. More striking or his lucid composition of trees, fence posts, gnarled trunks, and striated leaves. But even in these modes, White already seemed to be looking ahead to the planar distortions and plays of contrast that would shift his work more fully into the realm of abstraction, especially from his time in Rochester onwards. And in this example of a cow skull situated on a ledge, White can't seem to bring himself to the extremes of Edward Weston, who subordinates the vast landscape to the analytic purview of the camera. White cannot, for his part, fully relinquish the environmental context of the object, or the grand sweep of the Oregon landscape beyond. Indeed, by contrast, for Weston, a titanic figure in White's mind for at least the remainder of the decade, and he would later apprentice himself to Edward Weston at Point Lobos. For Weston, even the most epic of landscapes, that repository of awe-inspiring sublime beauty, what Kant called purposiveness without purpose, was stripped of its symbolic or effective value, made ever more potent grist for his eye's pursuit of tonal quality. This is perhaps most evident in his dunescapes at Oceano, which occupied the period of Weston's Guggenheim Award, and also White's pilgrimage to Oregon and his own high desert. But White could and did find refuge in another pillar of F64, Ansel Adams. Even before Beaumont-Newhall dispatched White from New York to establish a CSFA curriculum with Adams, by then a well-established presence in the Yosemite Valley, White had read his treatises on method in the journal Camera-Craft, and almost certainly his account of winter photography, which not only posited an archetype of the, quote, Western photographer forged in a rugged Sierra landscape, but also reported on methods of photographing the mountains in winter. That means carrying a small view camera, using snowshoes, adjusting for weather conditions, and the specific highlights of snowpack, and so on. This edict was at least implicit as White collected his exposures in eastern Oregon, a northern branch of Adams' own western mountains, complete with remote summits, broad vistas, and challenging approach hikes. Indeed, many Oregonians will recognize an image like this one on the screen. Somewhere between vacation snapshot and process document, a frequent model Earl Curtis skinning up a hillside on skis in the backcountry. One gets a sense of the crisp air, vivid sunlight, casting coniferous shadows on the powder field, perhaps wisps of spindrift accumulating in the margins. Adams would have cautioned against blue-sensitive film, or heavy filters in this case, and one might imagine his words resonating in White's mind. Quote, "The types of photography possible in Yosemite in winter are many and varied, from expansive landscapes to the minutiae of snow-powdered detail, from the quiet grandeur of mountain and forest to the thrilling sport of skiing," end quote. However, it's an important point to draw a contrast here. Adams pursued a more extreme version of pictorial aesthetics than White ever would. He became legendary for his pictures of the High Sierra in northern New Mexico, creating stirring pictures of the grandeur of the West. quiet or otherwise. So an image like this, which many of you are probably familiar with, is nothing if not exemplary of what we might call sublime beauty, a mode that came to prominence in the European Alps and the Germanic states during the late 18th century, as the land itself became less and less a place of terror and instead one of communion with divinity, sites to be explored, zones of romantic self-discovery, and ultimately redefinition of wilderness as such, places to be preserved and protected with the closing of the frontier. It was indeed paintings such as Thomas Moran's luminous handling of the hellish lunar terrain of northwestern Wyoming that in 1872 convinced Congress to establish the world's first national park. The Yosemite Valley and Half Dome were other Moran subjects, and it too would become a park in 1890. Adams was an inheritor to this tradition, and his photographs would further mediate these kinds of places as American cathedrals, sacred sites of an increasingly settled, militarized, and industrialized horizon. Ansel Adams was also a key officer in the Sierra Club and suggested to the American government that his pictures of those mountains could be used to political ends. The symbolic capacity of place and the sublime power of his pictures, like Moran's and W.H. Jackson's before him, was not lost on Adams. White never seems to have demonstrated such a political edge in his practice, working instead on cultivating his interior life and pursuing camera work not so much as a formal or social construct per se, but as a kind of ontological quest, a form of ascent, both spiritual and technical. Accordingly, even as he put F-64 to the test in Oregon, he steered a middle course between Weston's gelid beauty and Adams's sublime panoramas, all the while leaving clues about his own future practice. In more precise terms, White's Oregon photographs were exemplary of a genre called the picturesque, the making pictorial of nature, the generation of visual pleasure in the act of seeing. And White, not quite yet a budding Freudian, would scarcely deny the voyeuristic compensations of looking through the viewfinder, or the sometimes unconscious symbolism that would emerge in that process. That would yield, in short, scenes, landscapes in Eastern Oregon that say more about the photographer and the photographer's process than about the socio-political function of the result. Perhaps this is why some of White's fondest memories of this time are of taking pictures and then discussing philosophy or the day's work in the country, lounging with Fred Hill under a tree. Perhaps this is why he insisted on Hill's reproduction of those negatives, very much in the master's house, so to speak, of Ansel Adams' own enlarger and production room. Or indeed a more Freudian interpretation, one that he would later apply to himself, and one that he would use as a filter in describing the arrows, poles, generator coils, and so on, and for White would suggest a phallic resonance in the dynamic trees and foregrounds of many of his pictures, an important touchstone for a young man struggling with his own sexuality during a time of profound social repression. But there are much more obvious, less speculative readings here as well. If we consider the majority of White's Eastern Oregon photographs as landscape, they hew very closely to then by well-established aesthetic conventions of composition and tone. In particular, images such as these are quintessentially picturesque, that genre of beauty that guided generations of landscape architecture, painting, and as photohistorian Joel Snyder and others have argued, photography itself, in determining how the world might be composed pictorially. If aesthetics, after people like Burke, and certainly after Kant, suggest that classical beauty, and certainly the sublime beauty to be found at El Capitan or at Mont Blanc, are intrinsic to nature, the picturesque as a genre concerns itself with artifice and the representations of the world. The refinement of the picturesque as an aesthetic mode, especially in the realm of landscape, coincided with the Industrial Revolution, as the frontier line became ever more distant, and technological forces meant that the land was not to be feared, but romanticized as a zone of self-realization or cultivated contemplation, a managed place of amusement during a time when, as Rebecca Solnit has argued, the railroad, telegraph, and camera simultaneously annihilated spatial distance and indeed time itself. According to that foremost theorist of the picturesque, William Gilpin, the hallmarks of picturesque landscape were not so much that of epic singularity to be found in, for instance, the work of Ansel Adams, or the smooth containment of Weston's nature morte, but indeed in variation and roughness, the organization of terrain so that it rises to meet the lingering eye, rewarding it with a broad range of everyday forms, pictorially amplified through the play of light and shadow, the arrangement of a sinuous prospect, and the rumination on antiquated forms, from the weather around a cemetery to a crumbling barn set under a cloud-scattered sky, or the shimmering of a passing storm. The picturesque, in short, was the mode par excellence for 19th century landscape painting, from the Hudson River to the British academic elite, and later, those early pilgrims of the national park, the Carlton Watkinses and Edward Muybridges of the world. It is unclear to the degree to which White was familiar with any of these forebears. He would certainly come to know of Jackson, at least by way of Abbott and Newhall after the war, even purchasing a book on Jackson by the latter, which remains on his shelves to this day. White's photographs taken in Anthony Lakes or Hurricane Trail are nonetheless textbook. They are picturesque in the extreme. This alone is no great revelation. This sort of stylistic mapping might seem quaint in this day and age as a critical approach. However, as W.J.T. Mitchell and others have long argued, landscape is not merely a genre of vernacular realism, but indeed, it is an active verb, to landscape. At a minimum, White's organization of the Oregon terrain around him, from the high vantage after a long approach hike, his ordering of the peaks and desert into forms of inviting, visually pleasing pictorial space, suggest a certain romantic inheritance. These peaks and valleys were, in this account, places of painterly beauty, idealized human mastery of the earth by snowshoe or plowshare, and the coming age of a heroic young man in self-imposed exile. This is the stuff of Goethe or Friedrich or indeed Thoreau, situated at the outer edges of the American frontier, nearly 50 years after its closure. But while White seems to have considered his time in the West more generally in terms that were highly personal, one indeed of testing himself, discovering hidden reservoirs within, he also inherited a tradition of Western photography steeped in power, even violence. Specifically, even if Moran's and Jackson's use of picturesque beauty helped to frame the future national parks as sacralized repositories of divine providence in America, theirs and other photographers' data from the West were integral to a regime of knowledge emerging back east in which the frontier could and would inevitably be mastered, minerals extracted, fields planted, and existing inhabitants evicted. As Solnit and Snyder have both compellingly argued, pictures like this by William Henry Jackson note the picturesque vista here, shot from an elevated promontory, inviting the eye to follow the course of the river, the course of the rail and telegraph lines on its shores, and to be sure, the course of empire itself. These are all crucial to a larger project. There are echoes of this new American Arcadia in White's farmhouses, his fellow hikers at leisure in the high country, and also in his omissions. There is no animal life here, and no people beyond his immediate circle. It is worth noting that the places pictured by Minor White in 1940 and 1941 were, in their way, a Sierra Nevada in miniature, and the 1849 gold rush and the dispossession of the Modoc people in California, captured famously by Muybridge for Harper's Magazine, had their own equivalent in the Eastern Oregon gold rush of roughly the same period, for which towns like La Grande were important base camps. The Grande Ronde, for its part, had long been a place of convergence for the semi-nomadic First Nations of the area, the Walla Walla, Umatilla, Cayute, Nez Perce. These bands were unsurprisingly resettled in the years immediately following the 1855 Treaty of Walla Walla, as the American frontier line inched further and further towards the Pacific. These very figures were in fact captured typologically in the work of another Minnesotan transplant to the Northwest, the amateur ethnographer that Julia mentioned, Edward Curtis, as part of his larger multi-decade project of documenting the very people displaced by the mining and settlement of the valley that had attracted the hills, the WP extension facility, and so on. Landscaping, then, the making picturesque, is necessarily an act of both selective inclusion and exclusion. In the history of the American West, this has long been correlated with processes of settlement, the closing of the frontier, or as familiar to most of us, marking the grandeur of place, to simultaneously reify and to conserve a wilderness long called upon to define states such as Oregon and California. Clearly, among the F-64 photographers, White evinces the most sort of possible affinities with Ansel Adams, but crucially, he seemed to share nothing of Adams' more explicitly polemical brand of advocacy, working himself in the more hermeneutic zone of poetics, technical procedure, metaphor, and pedagogy. Which is to say, Adams knowingly adopted a deep history of Western landscape as a tool of persuasion, while Minor White waded into that stream on a more plainly spiritual terms that were nonetheless part and parcel of a socio-political history, inscribed into the very land and its subsequent representations. And so, locating these instances of landscaping Eastern Oregon as White honed his technique is meaningful for us for two reasons. On one hand, this somewhat overlooked area of his practice locates him in a deeper heritage of what Snyder has called territorial photography. One marvels at the serendipity of White's assignment to a remote corner of the state so richly sedimented in histories of exploration, extraction, and displacement so central to America's violent becoming. But then, that's the story of so much of the American West, and it's difficult to impugn cynical intent to White here. More like what we see here is his banal interpolation into larger aesthetic conventions that, by now, we largely take for granted. Indeed, this somewhat passé word, aesthetics, offers a second sense of what White was doing here, neither subordinating the outside world to formalist scrutiny, nor using it, as many of his forebears, as a discursive strategy. Instead, White's Oregon photos find him breaking with Weston, and in short, making pictures. For himself, sure, but also for us, his viewers in waiting. This is arguably a decisive point in his own practice, one that, as we will hear much more about later on, was notable for its insistence on deploying photography as not only a mode of documentary communication, but of carefully modulating the experience of the viewer. And here I'll offer a concluding note. By mid-century, such picturesque handling of American landscapes will return to the fore, from the emergence of earthworks in the 1960s to the so-called new topographics of the following decade. But it was Robert Smithson who would go as far as to carefully re-theorize the aesthetic categories by which landscape could be defined, locating them as a way of expanding the field of sculptural and photographic form. He cited his own intervention into the land as a distinctly American mode that short-circuited the strictures of the gallery and the blind alleys of medium specificity or purity, the formalism so much in the mainstream of the 1960s. Writing in the magazine Art Forum in 1973, a year after his own spiral jetty in northern Utah, Smithson argued that the picturesque was powerful precisely because it dialectically bridged the polarities of the beautiful and sublime, or for our purposes today, between Weston and Adams. Neither one nor the other, but something between that was always in a state of becoming. As a dialectic form, one that allows for irregularity of surface, the collision of nature and artifice, between the pristine and the despoiled, the picturesque was a dynamic and open-ended methodology. For Smithson, of course, the watchword was entropy. But by the 1960s, White, too, had become a kind of countercultural figure, immersed in Zen, occultism, and a range of new publications. For all of his technical rigor, his process, for all of his technical precision, his process had, if anything, become more centered around a word that has many affinities with entropy: chance. The unexpected collision between the photographer in a moment with the ground glass between. Such a play of chance and change prefigured White's insistence from the late 1940s onward on displaying his work in series. In this approach, itself a dialectic, communicative act with the viewer, each photograph gained resonance not as a self-contained artifact, but in relation to the total linear array of images, their meaning generated through contingency, and only, as the decades wore on, as new images emerged to speak to those older works in new ways. As he said simply of series in 1961, quote, "Such groups always contain surprises because the effect of the photographs on each other could not have been imagined till seen together," end quote. It's very tempting then to think of the Oregon landscapes as an exercise in dialectics, one that would frame his own sense of openness and provisionality. These photographs then might not be out of place in a trajectory with Smithson's own picturesque ruins in, for instance, his monuments of Passaic. Certainly there were other experiments during this time, investigations of clouds, which presage his own tutelage after the war with Alfred Stieglitz. Also importantly, homoerotic portraiture, and apparently some attempts at aerial photography, which didn't go so well. But as Fred Hill recounts, that last year, 1942, White seems to have run out of road, teaching too many camera classes, becoming listless and frustrated. His second 5-year plan was drawing to a close, and California was not far off. But he was changed as a photographer and as a person. This is when White became decisively a Westerner, with all that that implies. As is well known, by 1953 he left for Rochester and never really returned, only periodically, as we know. But he wrote to Ma Hill all the way through 1948, plainly miserable and remembering Legrand fondly. His memorable fancies in the years that followed expressed, as is well known, profound frustration. This was a repression of his own desire, of course, sublimated into image making, but also a sort of topographic repression as well. Those pages are full of longing for the West, both as a set of coordinates and as a psychogeographic sensibility. Those years in Oregon and the Bay Area seemed to weld together for him a sense of both authenticity and liberation. He would take this feeling in through small homeopathic doses, by returning to Portland periodically, and notably in 1963 and in 1967 on extended trips through the canyon lands of Utah with various protégés and collaborators such as Art Lazar. These marked his only other sustained engagements with the scale of Western landscape. At this stage, he is arguably at the height of his powers, and at times he indulges in a muscular formalism that rivals even Weston. And perhaps, more significantly, he would also even push past Weston here, into the open horizons of abstraction. The rough, picturesque surfaces of his youth in Legrand are manifested on the far side of his years in exile, during which he carefully refined his ability to work expressively and obliquely, wringing intimate immensity from the tighter confines of the Northeast, and in these images, the inverse, immensity made intimate. But on an even more elemental level, these images index a passage during which White felt fully alive, inhabiting a place of pure transgressive delight. In Utah, during those years, he was home in a way that he had not been since leaving Eastern Oregon, since leaving Oregon more generally on a troop transport some 20 years before. Thank you. I'm sorry, I know I have a tendency to speak kind of quickly. So I'm happy to clarify absolutely anything or take suggestions.
Ian, I have the microphone. Thank
Yeah.
you so much. There are multiple nooks and crannies to go through in your talk, but I'd love to make a comment and then potentially ask you a question,
Yeah.
or at least get your further thoughts on it. I really appreciate that you brought up the issue of how not political these Eastern Oregon images are. And in working with the material that we have here at the museum, I keep wanting to infuse politics into them, which to me it makes sense that they should be. These are WPA photographs. He's working for a government program. He's working at a time when the world is about to go to war. I feel like, and many of the photographs he's making are of, especially in Portland, are of parts of the city that no longer exist, or they're part of the economy. And I find that I can't push that angle. It just doesn't work because it seems like it's not there, and I struggle with it. So as a curator, I have to be careful to not overemphasize these ideas, but the work is so harsh and so striking in Eastern Oregon, and for those many people in this room have been there, it makes perfect sense. And so I also love that you sort of drew it back to what, like, potentially the King survey and O'Sullivan photographs and so on, which was very helpful to me. But do you find yourself wanting to infuse as much as possible, politically in there, and it's just not there, or am I alone in that?
No, I think that, hopefully one thing that I did communicate is that, much as you're describing with the WPA, there's all this atmospheric, architectural stuff in which the photographs are made. He can never escape that. So he is entering into a political dialogue, whether he wants to or not. But it is sort of frustrating if you're interested in these more sort of social histories of art, going through, sitting in the archive day after day, and you're looking for a more polemical or political connection. I mean, his life was, from his sexuality to where he lived to the things he was trying to do with photography. We can identify these things retroactively as being transgressive gestures, but he himself was so ruthlessly focused on being a good photographer and communicating what being a photographer was to students and so on. So I think there's a refusal and even redactions in his notes when he goes a little too far. So I think he would deny a political edge to these things, but I think it's latently there, but we have to be careful not to project too much. Yeah.
it may be that he saved some of his political kind of communications for the work that essentially didn't make it into the WPA portfolios. Another potential line of investigation there would be his work on Bonneville Dam, because the People's Power League was actually a citizen activist group. That's Peter Bunnell says that's the closest he ever came to politics, was working for that group, which was trying to negotiate for public utility districts that had cheaper rates than were going to come down through the BPA. Although there's some kind of contradictory evidence in the documentation whether he actually worked for the BPA or worked doing work for the People's Power League, which that would be a interesting area to follow up on to go into your question a bit more.
I also just want to make clear, I'm part of the reason I was attracted to these is I lived for a summer in a pickup truck kind of in this part of the world as well. Grad school was so wonderful that way. But it's okay to like these images. That's part of what he was doing, and that's the power of the picturesque, to produce images that we want to look at, that feel familiar to us, that tame the landscape in a way. So I think for those of you who know Eastern Oregon or the Sierras, there's something very special about these images as well, even without these kind of more structural or political readings. And I'm just trying to imagine him coming from Minnesota, right, and seeing this.
In the little that I know about Ansel Adams, I think he was involved in some polemical battles in the 30s with pictorialists. And did Minor White have anything to say about that group of photographers?
Which group?
I think there were the people who like these kind of fuzzy imaged.
Oh, pictorialists.
Yeah, pictorialists. Yes.
Yeah.
I was wondering if he had anything to say on that topic.
Well, there are scattered references that I found are archivally, but generally speaking, he's making a polemical argument implicitly by what he says we should do, as opposed to what he says we shouldn't do, I think. So certainly if you were a photographer, an amateur creative photographer in the 20s and 30s, and you're reading journals, pictorialism was the style. And there was even a passage about an Oregon-based critic in the 1930s deriding the F-64 group because he says they're sort of very poorly adopting European precisionism. I mean, pictorialism was incredibly popular and resonant for many people. So it's hard to imagine now, but the kind of straight modernist photography that people like he was doing and learning from Ed Weston and Ansel Adams was pretty radical at the time and controversial. So I think just electing to choose those reference points, Berenice Abbott in New York or Adams and Weston, that was a declaration of sorts for where his affinities lie. And as he said, he was testing those procedures here.
Ian, thanks for that. It was a really fascinating discussion of this work. And the picturesque, I think, is a useful category for describing these things. But I guess I still register a certain hesitation in the notion of the taming versus what I would call the tamed landscape. So that, for instance, if I were to see how Adams would approach this landscape, he would avoid spaces which were parcelized, right? So the whole point, I think, of White's revision of that tradition is that the landscape is always already shot through with the human, rather than the Weston and Adams kind of stripping bare. So that, I mean, this is close, of course, to what Adams is up to, but the way that it completely clarifies the sense in which this land has been shaped in a kind of already inhabited all the way down to a certain extent, strikes me as like crucial for White's approach. I mean, I'll talk about later his kind of commitment to anthropomorphization, but to see it always already as tamed and humanized seems to be his kind of, his take. I'm not sure what you kind of think of that.
No, that's very helpful, and I think a kind of level of precision that I should be clear about. Yeah, I think, so it's all on a spectrum, but if we look at Adams, he's really working in more of a sublime, picturesque tradition of capturing an unspoiled wilderness that really only exists as a cordoned off part of the United States. It exists more in our imagination, and we have to protect it through the park system. But I think the picturesque more generally, particularly in British versions, for instance, you always see people in the frame as well. It's people coexisting in farmsteads and so on, or people in the Hudson School with easels looking out over the Oxbow or something. So I think you're absolutely right. The picturesque assumes a tamed landscape, and that's partially why I think for someone like Tom Mitchell, it's so dangerous in a way, because it suggests that there is no wilderness, that the land can be contained, can be tamed, like that Jackson photograph of the railroad line and the telegraph line. So I think this is a crucial distinction. Thank you.
I'll just add, and it's partly because you opened with the anecdote about Hill wanting to recreate the photo, that on the heels of Todd's comment, I think part of what's critical here is access. In addition to it being a tamed landscape, the idea, whether we're talking about Moran and getting an easel up there, or whether we're talking about the snake of the railway and telegraph lines in the William Henry Jackson, or this photograph that Tom Hill knows on some level he could go back and recreate decades later, there's a sense of access. So while it may be cordoned off, there's a belief that others could get there, others could see this same view, others could even potentially frame or reframe this same view. And that may be helpful, and certainly reminds me of the slide you started with, the framing device. Thanks, Ian.
Yeah, thanks, Kate.
I'm curious with respect to the technical aspects. Some of us old-timers lived with the zone system manual, which to me reflected White's insistence on technical expertise. And I must have reread that 20 times because there was an error in it that I don't know if people had caught, but I'd be curious as to your response to his insistence on real technical expertise, perhaps even greater than Ansell's at one time.
In these days, the zone system still, I think, a ways off in his mind. Correct me if I'm wrong, but he's developed more of a philosophical approach and learning from who are then the masters of this modernist form in the Western U.S. So he's already got a clear appreciation for the technical dimension, but he's not arrived at the zone system yet. And I think we see him sort of hashing it out here and figuring that out. We were noting upstairs in the exhibition that even after 2 years of printing in Oregon, he was already a masterful printer. It was remarkable. But then you have other examples. I'm just going to scroll back through quickly here. Let's see, what's a good one here? Like, I don't think this one's printed particularly well, right? And some of these just don't work out. And if you look archivally as well, he printed these in many different forms. But I think for him, it's really hard to capture the kind of light you have in Oregon and in the West in general. So really harsh light, the strong blues you get in town and in the mountains. This is why in 35, Adams is writing about how to take pictures in the mountains, because people just didn't know how to do it very well, by and large. So I think this time it seems like he'd more or less mastered printing shots in the city, but he was still figuring out how to take pictures in nature, as it were. So I would say it was crucial to him, but it was a time of experimentation rather than having arrived, and some of these are certainly better than others. I don't know if that fully answers your question, but yeah. And he was using large cameras as well.
I work at the Oregon Historical Society. I'm going to be on the next panel. And in hearing your presentation, I was thinking about when I started working at the Historical Society, I was surprised to find minor white negatives in our collection. And the other collection that we have that I was also surprised to find was Carlton Watkins' Mammoth, original Mammoth prints. And the minor white we have are not landscape. But I couldn't help but wonder, most of those mammoths that we have, I'm pretty sure came in before White would have left Portland. And so I'm curious if you or anybody has seen anything where he talks about Carleton Watkins, if he was aware of Carleton Watkins, if he even visited the Historical Society to look at the mammoth prints, and if there was any overlap there, just as another Western and specifically Oregon landscape photographer.
I would love if someone in the audience could help with this, because he mentions in Memorable Fancies that he was so interested in doing other stuff while he was here that he doesn't write as much as he could have, which can be a little frustrating. But so the references that he gives, at least in the Princeton archives, I've listed here. So if people know of other stuff he was looking at whilst here, that would be really interesting.
I was just going to add, he definitely was, during this time frame, he was reading everything he could get his hands on about the history of photography as well as the technique, and was giving lectures in the 40-41 time period on like the first 100 years in photography. It would be interesting to know if who he was pointing to, but in 58 he did address in sort of a lecture that he gave called Two Photographs. He said that at the time this period, the pictorial field was what I was most interested in, any way I could get a hold of it. For a definition of the pictorial, we can use a rather simple one in which the subject is less important than the image or photograph. Now, that does not mean that the subject disappears, but it does mean that the photographer and those who like this kind of photography are concerned with the design elements, conscious of it, make use of it, and recognize the communication or the evocation of an emotional side that design can bring about. Which I just thought it was interesting that he sort of was looking at pictorialism that way and not necessarily kind of the soft focus, kind of, early Steichen kind of salon type that we usually associate with the term.
Yeah.
Thank you. I've been interested in the history of Oregon photography for a long time, and in the early 1990s I started meeting on a monthly basis with most of the people who were members of the camera club with Minor White, and I didn't know Minor because he had already passed away, but I knew most of the other people who were involved in his camera club, the YMCA camera club. And I've also read Camera Craft cover to cover, and most photography magazines from the period, and studied them. And it would be difficult to explain how people thought about fine art photography in the 1930s. It just wouldn't make sense anymore. Edward Weston sent his prints to the art museum for inclusion in an exhibition, and they were rejected. Only one judge, Henry Berger, voted for them to be included because they were straight photography, and that is not what art photography was considered to be in the 1920s and 30s, and this is why Edward Weston, Ansel Adams, and Minor White were all so revolutionary. They were definitely tipping the apple cart over as to what Minor knew. And when he knew it, Minor arrived in Portland with a 35mm camera and was taught how to develop film by Ray Wing, but soon became the teacher. And he advanced so quickly that he went from student to teacher in just the period of 2 short years. And he was an instructor with Don, and they were the instructors in the YMCA. He went from 0 to 100 in a very short period of time, in a world that's much different than what it is now.
Absolutely, and it's hard to remember that. I mean, photography was largely maligned in the art world, such as it was, and the history itself doesn't even really start emerging. I mean, as we know it, until maybe even the 1940s and 50s, correct me if I'm wrong. So people like Beaumont Newhall are laying down the first draft and putting together the first textbooks. And in the 1930s, you would have had to have looked to the very journals that you mentioned, right? these amateur photographic journals. So to be able to say, here is the first 100 years of photography, here's where I land in that lineage, it would have been hard to imagine at that time, right, in a way that we could now.
I just have a short question. That is, we seem to talk about Minor White from here in Portland when he first came from Minnesota. But do we know anything about his childhood and his school life, any of his artwork as a teenager? Or I remember that his father especially wasn't particularly fond of what he wanted to do with his life. But was there anything left? They seemed to correspond with his mother.
From what I can tell, in the fancies, those entries are very spotty, right? And he even says to Lynn Hill that he has to go after, as the war is coming to an end, he has to go back to Minneapolis, and he says he doesn't want to. He wants to see her instead because, in effect, the people in Oregon had become his real family, and his Minnesota family didn't understand him. But that's about the extent to what I can remember about him. If anyone else can answer that question.
I can answer parts of it, and anyone, please feel free to correct me. But I do find it very interesting that Minor was someone who it took a little bit longer for him to move into exactly what he wanted. So there was some interest in photography as a youth. Apparently his grandfather showed lantern slides quite often and so on. He originally studied botany. He thought he might go into the sciences. Literature, poetry were also incredibly important to him at first. So it takes him a while to actually graduate from university and then from there move on and decide to come out to Portland. And or it may have actually been Seattle where he was trying to go but ran out of money in Portland. So there is this kind of faceted young life. And correct me if I'm wrong, that I believe his parents found out about his sexuality early on. I believe they had read one of his writings or his diary. So there was no real communication about that, but there is an indication that, you know, his sexuality is an issue early on, and he is journaling about it and writing about it, and it is discovered, and it's just kind of swept under the rug. So there are issues within his core family, certainly, that are going on, and perhaps discomforts. But for him to spend time in, you know, Minnesota and figure out where does he want to go? Is it the sciences? Is it the arts? And then eventually makes his way here. But that is my general understanding of these early years. I don't know about any particular artwork other than writing that he would have been making at that time.
I was just going to add to that. Ian mentioned the 5-year plans, and so at least in his own narrative of that transition from verse and poetry, he explicitly said, I'm going to give Minnesota in 1937, I'm going to give myself 5 years to try to find poetry and photographs, and sort of made this conscious change in medium, and like many people during the Depression, just kind of headed west, got on a bus, and didn't have a destination, obviously didn't have a job lined up. But the notion was that he was going to try it out for 5 years, and if it didn't work out, then he would probably keep looking in another venue.
And it worked out.
I'm cognizant of time, so we should. All right, thanks.
Thank you so much, Ian. We are going to move next to our panel discussion. So I'm going to, it might just take us a couple of moments. So if you need to take a quick break, please feel free to do so. But we will gather on the stage and talk about Minor White's archives right here in Portland and as well in Princeton. So we'll be with you in just a moment. All right, we're about to start our panel session, the session before lunch. And I'm really excited that so many of us can be up here on stage to talk about the various issues that we encounter with minors' archival materials. Two of our institutions are both art museums, but we handle some archival materials right here at the Portland Art Museum. And then at Princeton as well. And then some other institutions are more archivally based, and some people have been able to visit and work with all of these archives, and really, in Ken's instance, he'll be talking first, is able to get into all of the archival collections in great depth. So we're going to talk about multiple things, the aspects of our archives, some of the problems we encounter, because problems and issues come up over time, and as times change, and we reconsider the ways to archive what we have. But I hope that you will agree with me at the end of this that the ability to house and take care of and into the future these objects, both documents, photographs, everything else that comes along with it, is a critical part of the work that we do, and we plan to continue as best we can into the future. I will introduce our panelists first, and then we will go one by one and talk about our various archival situations, and then we'll open it up to questions or any discussion before lunch. To my left on the end is Ken Hawkins. Ken began his archival career as a work-study undergrad, creating the inventory of White's WPA negatives at the Oregon Historical Society. So the individual who asked that question about negatives and other holdings, I think it was Stephen, Ken is the man to talk to. He earned a PhD in history at the University of Rochester and has worked at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. since 1993. He managed the transfer of the Obama White House electronic records to the archives, including over 2 million digital photographs by Pete Sousa. Some of you in the audience may have been in Pete's audience when he was here recently, and I think he's coming again or has just come for a second time. More recently, he authored the entry on Minor White in the Oregon Encyclopedia, which was just published this past week. To my immediate left is Matthew Cowen. Matthew is the archivist for moving images and photography at the Oregon Historical Society just across the street. And prior to moving to Oregon, he worked for many years at Anthology Film Archives in New York City. To my right is Val Ballestrom, and Val is the education manager with the Architectural Heritage Center. He has a master's degree in history and public history from Portland State University. In 2017, he curated the Architectural Heritage Center's exhibit, Parting Shots, Minor White's Images of Portland, 1938 to 1942, which included matching several of White's photographs with artifacts from buildings that appear in the photographs. The exhibit just received an Oregon Heritage Excellence Award from the Oregon Heritage Commission. And hopefully some of you were able to see that absolutely fantastic exhibition at the center, but Val will be showing you some photographs of the installation. And to my right on the end is Catherine Goodwin. Catherine is manager of collections information at the Princeton University Art Museum and oversees the cataloging of and access to information about works of art. Catherine's particular interests are open access to art information and images for research and scholarship and cross-institutional collections discovery. So we will begin with Ken's roundup, if you will, of his experiences in these various archives.
Let this go green. Thank you, Julia, and thank you for having me. Good morning, everyone. So this is a session near and dear to my heart. One of the great things about archives is that they can take you behind the scenes and also behind the official narrative of any given topic. And these two photos here sort of do that in kind of a snapshot way. The one on the left is a Minor White's first 4x5-inch negative in his archive. It's an AGFA nitrate-based film. It was taken early in 1938 up along First Street between Pine and Oak. So he was interested in the architecture of the old buildings and also the quality of light from before, 6 months at least before he was actually hired to work for the WPA. The second one on the right there is a WPA photograph, but it's untitled, as it's held by the Portland Art Museum, and it's also as a circa date. Interestingly, Miner excluded the waterfront portfolio from his memoirs, even though it was circulated in exhibitions under the WPA. And if one starts to try to integrate and do research in the various archival repositories of WPA prints, you can fill in those dates. So we can identify the date this was taken, and we can also identify the exact location, not just from research, but from other WPA prints that actually are captioned. So White began his career as part of a trust to create artwork in the public domain. His writing and teaching aimed to eliminate barriers between amateur and advanced photographers, and he wanted to reach people from all backgrounds and get them interested in photography and camera clubs at the YMCA and these community art centers. As he wrote just a year or so after he arrived in Portland, he said, quote, "We would like to foster a spirit of comradeship in picture taking." So this is kind of my attempt at a timeline of the relationship between his work here in Portland, the 5 years he was here in Oregon between 1937 and 1942. And so the top is kind of a picture cloud going over the kind of the subject matter and the locations of his photographs while he was here in the state. And one of the things that I have tried to do in the presentation here is to use pictures that are not from the print portfolios, so you can get a little bit of flavor of what kind of the outtakes are or what some of the pictures are behind the actual portfolios. So with limited exceptions, such as the man standing in the doorway of the Dodd building, a good number of the remaining photos will be from the Minor White Archive or from the OHS negative set to sort of make some of the points that I want to make. So along the bottom, and it may be obscure, but it's basically a timeline, 37 to 42. And what I did was sort of describe or put bars in for the different repositories and the coverage that they have across those years. That is, the materials, for example, on the bottom in blue at OHS, that set of 200 negatives basically covers from about October 1938 to June of 1940, and then it sort of cuts off. The Portland Art Museum has this found set of negatives that picks up from about January of 1940 and goes through the latter part of the year and sort of fills in the gaps. And then Princeton, of course, has archival material that predates his Portland years to some extent, but then also goes well into the future and up through the 1960s, so as we saw from Ian's presentation. Give a shout out to the county library. Its portfolio is actually the only complete finished portfolio with captions in sequence as was originally intended. Everything else are basically the portfolios that were transferred as a whole, and so the exact order is not really known. And of course, for someone for whom sequences became important later on, it's interesting to see kind of this one early example that was turned over in the summer of 1939. So if you consider his work as a whole, what happened in 1942, I kind of use the analogy of taking a deck of cards, cutting it, and never shuffling those two sides of the deck back together. The work, the underlying negatives and the prints were basically split up. So as Julia said, there's about 107 or 108 prints here. There's 200 negatives at OHS. There's these other sets. But White took about 3 times as many negatives from this period with him that ended up at Princeton after his death. And I think there's altogether maybe about 150 prints from the Oregon period. But which was sort of mind-boggling to me that there was so much work that was behind the official prints and the prints that he also chose to include in his memoirs and in his sort of retrospective musings in memorable fancies. So you could extend the timeline to include other repositories and also including the National Archives where the WPA records are, which fill in a lot of the context. And also you go to the Portland period, when he came here for the Centennial Exposition and put together the Return of the Bud, there were about 4 or 5 pictures from the Portland years, and that's included in that exhibit. And he was also beginning to formulate his memoirs and the ideas behind his memoirs. So he was looking back, and when that exhibit was installed here in Portland in 1959, he wrote in his journal, "I feel that a trajectory that started in Portland, Oregon in 1938 has been completed. These pictures, made as long as 20 years ago for reasons far different from now, are being torn from their original context to serve a different purpose. It's a little terrifying." So White omitted critical aspects of his work and life in telling it as a trajectory of photographing manifestations of spirit from Portland and back. For that matter, the portfolios of historic Portland also wove a narrative. And then, of course, the dispersal and sort of the alienation of the records into all these far-flung reaches also makes it a bit of a challenge to put his life back together and sort of get at behind the scenes as to what was his life like, what were the forces that were shaping his work at a lower level than just the narrative he told or the narrative that the WPA told. So when you start digging into the archives, they are rich with stories that are outside those sanctioned narratives. Within a year of arriving here, he was writing a how-to column for the Bonneville Gun and Rod Club and put into print his earliest ideas about he reminded his photography students and readers to think ahead about what effect the photograph would have on the viewer before you took it. He also was interested in eliminating the barrier between amateurs and professionals or accomplished photographers. So he's very interested in teaching and sort of reaching out and having a life in photography that wasn't just the sort of rarefied narrative, and certainly that's a thread, but there's a lot of teaching, a lot of thought going into this. Interestingly, just by going and visiting the archives, that publication from May and July of '38 is 5 years earlier than the other previously earliest documented article that he wrote, which was in 1943. So just sort of digging in the archives, you can find some really cool stuff. Speaking of which, the photograph there in the middle is the earliest dated photograph in the Minor White archive from December 22nd, 1937. And it goes to one of his other favorite sort of offline topics of shooting was nocturnal or nighttime photography. So it's a picture of the Christmas display at the Beverly Hotel, December 22nd, 1937. And then just some of the other outtakes that sort of show his work on the street. And he was using also the small handheld camera, medium format. And so he actually was a fairly accomplished street photographer and had an affinity for taking pictures of people. The lower right there is just basically a document from the WPA files that's a request for a biographical sketch. So E.J. Griffith talked to Miner, put together a short biographical sketch. It mentions Bonneville, it mentions a couple other things, it mentions the 5-year plan. So it's just kind of a nice little addition. So his WPA assignment came, he was doing all that kind of work, making friends, and he got the job. Actually, Joseph Danish, who was in San Francisco and was a friend of Ansel Adams, who had set up the gallery in the 1930s, was the regional administrator of the art program for the WPA, and he basically was pulling the strings behind the scenes to get a creative photographer hired in Oregon, and the wheels were turning on that from early 1937. They weren't happy with the staff photographer, they wanted a creative photographer. And it's a good thing to note that the WPA's creative photographers are different from the ones that were hired by the Farm Security Administration, like Dorothy Lang and Arthur Rothstein and the others. So they were doing more truly creative original work, and included the Westons, who there are papers in the archives that indicate that Edward Weston specifically didn't want it publicized that he was working for the WPA. But there are prints of his in collections. So when he was hired by Marjorie Hoffman Smith, his remit here for the WPA work was to, quote, document by nostalgia. And this aligned with the Federal Art Project's goal to create a usable past through art made broadly available to the public. So he captured scenes of historic Portland in the portfolios, largely without reminders of modern life, so that the viewer could imagine the pride that those earlier citizens had in their city, and those were basically his words. So for the most part, when you look at the portfolios for the historic Portland, he would choose times of day when there were no cars around, and to sort of, imagine what the earlier period had been like, and they also were largely absent of people, unlike his offline photography. They also remarkably included, they were telling a story, so they included no photos of the demolition. But if you look at the OHS set, probably 50% of those are actual photographs of the demolition. So I just chose a couple of these photographs. From the left ones from the Minor White Archive, there's a very close parallel one at OHS of the view of the Dodd and building on Front Avenue from the New Market Theater. And then he often would incorporate modern cars in these pictures of the old buildings. And the one on the lower right is also from the Minor White Archive that shows some of the demolition work that was going on. So his negatives have proven quite useful over the years for historians of Portland architecture and history. In fact, they probably were more widely used and disseminated as architectural history, at least in the local press, than they had been used elsewhere, or that he elected to use. So the other interesting thing is that in his memoir, he acknowledged the WPA origins of his Portland photographs, but of the architectural photographs, but he ignored the waterfront portfolio in his memoirs, and that portfolio was done at the same time, and was with a much more sort of modernist vision. So just in sort of combing through the archives at Princeton, and then in the set of negatives that Julia referenced from that came mysteriously to the Art Museum in the 1950s, they have copy photographs of some of the other Oregon Art Project artwork that was done. And there's a particular painter, Virginia Darcy, who painted this image on the right, which is, I think, basically one of them is modeled on the other, or it's the Cooch Street dock. So if you look at the alignment of the buildings, the smokestack of the ship that's docked there, it's essentially a take on the same scene, and it may have just been a coincidence since the Cooch Street dock was 3 blocks north of the Oregon Art Project headquarters, but it was just a nice little discovery in the archives. So basically, going back to the narrative that was established by the WPA central office curated the exhibitions. They selected the photographs, they assembled them, they matted them, they framed them. The prints were sent back to Washington, but the exhibits were actually assembled there, and so of all the photographs that were done, they made a subset into the exhibits, and those went through the art centers. So as Julie mentioned, and Ian, the LeGrand period, when he goes up to Eastern Oregon and he's teaching and then managing the art center, that whole center was really about putting artwork in the hands of the community and having classes and running activities. And so his actual first nationally published photographs came from that period. They appeared in the American Federation of Art's art magazine of art from Washington, D.C. And it's a photo that's probably familiar to some of us, the art auction from the WPA's National Art Week. So it was this big push by the central WPA administration to promote community engagement and to essentially create a market for art that was sort of midway between sort of popular art and fine art. And his work was actually praised in an editorial in the LeGrand newspaper that was picked up and published and abstracted into the magazine of art. And Eleanor Roosevelt, who was visiting the art gallery of the WPA in Washington, had stopped by, so the assistant administrator said, "I'm sorry I missed you," in a letter, but I wanted to tell you more about the art project. And so she sent the editorial about the LeGrand Art Center to Mrs. Roosevelt and quoted from it. But she also said to her that the art center is designed to serve all classes of people. Its doors are wide. There are no restrictions as to race or creed, no requirements as to previous special training. So I just wanted to kind of emphasize that this was the context in which Minor White's career and the values that shaped it started. So this symposium is really an excellent beginning to sort of looking at the archival kind of context and the resources. And I hope as we go forward that we will be able to sort of virtually reunite the archives, and also in doing that make sure that all of the WPA photographs are clearly and explicitly identified, so that the people who are out there using them know that they are in the public domain and freely accessible. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't have any slides. I am an archivist at the Oregon Historical Society. I started there 5 years ago, almost exactly. And I came in not just for photography, but also for moving images, film, and video. So I really split my time. And really my background is actually more in motion picture, film preservation, and archiving. But I went to art school. I knew who Minor White was when I showed up here. And I was like, why do we have all these original Minor White negatives? And I'm still honestly asking myself that question, even though thanks to Ken, a lot of that is starting to come into play. But really what I inherited was approximately, I think, 205 negatives, plus or minus one, a bunch of folders with a lot of correspondences and copies of newspaper articles and lots of question marks. There seemed to be an assumption that these were produced as a WPA-funded project, but there was no clear definition that that was actually the case. It was interesting to see some of Julia's slides this morning. We do not have any correspondences from Minor. We do not have any documentation. We do not have accession records. There's literally no mention at all of why, when, or how they came into the collection, and I think what Ken has been doing recently has helped to kind of answer some of those questions, which is super helpful. Even, what was it, a week or two ago, Ken sent basically a well-researched document solidifying that these were public domain WPA documents, and that was literally just a couple weeks ago that we, in my mind, got first real solid evidence that that was the case. OHS for a long time, and maybe still is very risk adverse when it comes to things like copyright, so that really held us back in terms of making them available because we really weren't sure where they were. So one of the first things I did was created what I called an illustrated inventory, which I think was for the first time where we had Minor's negative numbers, our negative numbers, a description of the content, and an actual scan of the photo all in the same spreadsheet, and I was able to share that with Ken. I think I've shared it with Julia and other people. So for the first time, these things were all linked together, and I hope at least that helped move some of these things along. But there was a lot of questions. Some examples of that is we have documentations from the 70s of OHS staff members coming to the art museum saying, why do we have these? Do you have these? Why do you have them? And the art museum saying, we don't know why we have these either. These funny kind of memos dictating this. And OHS for a long time, well into the 2000s, had a wet lab, a functioning wet lab at our facility. And so what happened in the 70s is we said to the art museum, oh, you have all these prints. We will make copy negatives of these prints if we can keep copies for ourselves so that we can have them available for researchers in our library. So we actually, which only in some ways added to the confusion, is that we then had all of the negatives, we don't know where they came from. We then had all these funny PAM prints and copy negatives that we soon lost track of why we had them. So coming to the 80s and 90s, we just have all these Minor White materials, again, with no clear definition. So it led to, at least for me coming in 5 years ago, just a lot of questions. And I could tell people, kind of my predecessors had the same questions. And I work in a 100,000 square foot warehouse out in Gresham. We have, I see Tom here and John, we have millions and millions and millions and millions of photo negatives, glass negatives, cased images. So Minor White, then, this one little tiny, tiny collection is just one drop in this bucket. So it's easy, I think, for people to say, well, why do we have these things? And then the next week they move on to something else. So there's kind of this funny buildup. One thing of note, kind of the only thing we have that lists maybe that Minor gave them to us is there was a newspaper article presumably written when Minor came to town in 1960, and there's a brief little one line in the article that says, When Miner left to go to World War II, he left all WPA, non-WPA images with the Oregon Historical Society and the Portland Art Museum. It is not a quote, it is just, the journalist included it in there. So literally then we clung to that one little bit of thing and just passed it down now decades later. So it's really great to be able to be a part with people who are more minor white scholars who can answer some of these questions, and then we can work towards getting them, more publicly available and work with places like Princeton. Thank you.
Matthew, that was a great entry point for me to talk about a particular situation, because we have our minor white works in some ways in different places. So we of course have the prints amongst our artworks with our accessioned works of art in the collection. We then have some records that pertain to those works of art in the registrar's office. We then have the negatives that came from the WPA semi-mysteriously in the early to mid-1950s in our library's archives. They have recently been moved actually to our freezer because some deterioration is starting to happen, so we needed to stop that, and we need to have those negatives conserved. So we have these different pockets of minor white objects in these different places, and as Matthew had mentioned, it takes a long time sometimes to unravel these mysteries and then to properly treat the objects. So I'm going to talk about, you may remember this slide, I had this up earlier, the 1942 photographs of the Dolphin Lindley houses that were then subsequently torn down in 1942 and then 1951. And Val will talk about those as well, because he made those photographs at a time that he was about to leave for basic training. He had been drafted. It's 1942. He was drafted in April, and so he had to leave them behind. And he's, first of all, we see here the Board of Trustees says, yes, we will pay Minor White $150 to make these photographs of historic houses. He makes them. He leaves, and then we have evidence that he, while relocated to Hawaii, he is concerned about those negatives. Are they good enough? How did the prints go? Was Grant able to print from them, and so on? And that leaves him in a place where he has no control over these works. This is part of the file as well, which I thought was really interesting. We have, I think, a little over 100 of the original negatives, but I love seeing that Miner actually made sort of schematic floor plan drawings of what he was actually about to work on at the time. And so what we have originally is we had a set of negatives. Those negatives were printed by a man named Grant. Those prints were shown on a couple of occasions. So to me, in many ways, the vintage, the closest that we get to the negative is from those 1942 prints. But you'll notice when you see these numbers are accession numbers. So the prints that I'm talking about that were made in 1942 for the exhibition in 1942 that Grant made, they have an accession number over here of 2017, which means that we technically acquired them, even though we've always had them and they're our property. We brought them into the fine art collection just last year, technically. But then the negatives have an accession number of 1942. That's what the 42.30.45 and so on are. And this is where, if you hear the term best practice for whatever business you're in or whatever type of work you do, best practice changes over time. And things were a little looser, back in the day. What ended up happening, I'll go back for a second, is that for some reason, the negatives were given the original 1942 accession number, and then the prints were matched to that number. And then later prints were made as well. So in many cases, we ended up having 3 objects under a single number. And we can't do that. It doesn't work. Every unique object has to have its own unique number, or else we can't find it, right? If we need it, or like which one is the original, which one is the one that we want to use. And so for whatever reason, and mainly because everybody's super busy over the past, how many years now? 70 years. these objects had a single number, even though there were 3 of them at a time. And we finally were able to start working through taking care of these objects and getting them their proper numbers so that we can then get them photographed, get them online, and get them to people who may want to research them or just, have a look. I'm showing you this too because this indicates the next set of prints that was made. In 1979, some of you may personally have known Al Mahner, wonderful photographer. We have over 100 of his photographs in the collection. These negatives that were accessioned objects were handed over to him in 1979. We don't really do that kind of thing anymore. And as you can see, hand-carried by Mr. Mahner, and he made contact prints from them. And if you look at the top right, it says, making 2 sets of contact prints for records and reference, 1 set for Princeton Art Museum. So Peter Bonnell had asked for his own set of contact prints to keep them with everything else that he had of Mahner's in Princeton. So Al Mahner went very diligently, made 2 sets of contact prints, which made it very interesting because then I'm showing you here what we have. We've got the negative on the left, which is the original object, and then we've got an Al Mahner print, and if you flip to the other side of the contact print, the accession number is the same accession number as the negative. So in certain instances, I've got a negative, I've got the 1942 print, and then I also have the 1979 print, and they all had the same number. So we had to, over a couple of days, and I'm looking at our head of library and online, Maggie, I apologize, I'm forgetting your entire title because it's wonderful. But our head of library and our registrars and I had to sit down and figure out what we wanted where, and where we wanted to say, this is an object that needs to remain with the art collection. These are objects that need to be moved to the archival side. And to add another layer, we also have another full set of photographs from the negative. We have a full set of prints that Stu Levy, many of you know Stu Levy, made back in about 1994 or 1995 because some of you may know the book Heritage Lost. There's a wonderful book called Heritage Lost that is all about the Dolphin Lindley houses. And we didn't have a full set of the original prints, and aesthetics had changed a little bit. They were perhaps not big enough and so on. So Stu printed an entire new round of prints from the negatives, and those were accessioned into the art collection in 1995. So at any given time, I'll go to this first, I may have 4 objects, the negative, and then 3 prints, one from 1942, one from 1979, and one from 1995. So these are the things that we on occasion have to parse out. And I show you this. This was quite a find that I found just last week at Princeton. This is a letter from Mahner, not at all remembering that the museum had any of his work. I don't know, this is 1973, so he's ill at this point. It's also like 40 years on, but he doesn't remember that we had his work. And he says, I've heard this information. If you had negatives, I'll return them, but can I print from them? Again, not something we would do today. But then at the time, Bill Foster, who's now the head of the Film Center, who's our assistant registrar, he says, oh, no, well, these are all the things that we have of yours. Sure, if you want to print from your negatives, that's fine. And yes, we will absolutely take other photographs that you have as well, because Mahner says, well, I have other work too. Would you like some other work? Unfortunately, we didn't get any additional work from him at that time. So these are the types of issues that do come up with someone whose work, the original negatives have passed from place to place. There are people involved in different areas trying to do really good things, but even the simple act of giving every object its own number becomes incredibly important. So these are the types of things that our registrars, that we as curators, that our archivists and our librarians work with on a day-to-day basis, again, so that information can get out to the public more readily online.
Hello. So, in 2017, the Architectural Heritage Center, where I work, we had this exhibit, Minor White Parting Shots, images of Portland 1938 to 1942. And we were, if you're not familiar with the Architectural Heritage Center, we have thousands and thousands of pieces of buildings that were torn down over many decades, mostly from the 50s into the 80s. But we have a few earlier things that have come through various sources over the years. And one of the things that we knew we had were pieces from a couple of houses. What we call the Knapp House, referred to here as the Lindley House, but also the Dolph House as well. And so we approached the Portland Art Museum and Oregon Historical Society, knowing, thanks to Ken, I had a little insider knowledge that that OHS had that spreadsheet that Matt mentioned with the photos, and I was like, can I see that? And so one thing led to another, and then the Art Museum gave the okay, and the Oregon Historical Society gave the okay to use prints from, to make prints from files that they provided. So I spent lots of hours poring over images, digital images that they provided me, so I could see sort of the details. Because from our point of view, we were interested in what might be in those images that shows up in some of our, or where we have artifacts, right? So this is an example of some of the photos we had. Here we have a better view. And so, excuse me. So we, like I said, I poured over these images, and I had to pare it down at one point, to roughly 3 dozen photos, where I knew that we didn't have artifacts that showed up in every one of those photos, but we had a lot of wall space to fill. And so one of our main gallery we used with artifacts from the Dolph House, which are the wooden pieces you see here on the right, or actually throughout that image there. Those wooden pieces are all from the Dolph House. And the image on there's a metal piece at the far right there that you can sort of make out is a piece from a building called the Lad Block, which we also have several artifacts from. Here's a close-up of that. And I think the photo here was shown earlier. And these photos, I wanted to, when I selected them, I was, like I said, I was looking for details to find architectural, artifacts in the background of these photos. And you can't see it here, but in the background, you could just make out one of these stamped metal features. And there's actually one right over the doorway where that fellow is standing. And then these two guys are sitting in front of the junk store, but in the background at the corner is another view of the same building. And I was like, oh, there it is. We can show these. So we had these two images associated with the Lad Block, even though the Lad Block as a whole was not shown in Minor White's photos. And this was a really different approach to doing an exhibit for us. Architectural Heritage Center, for years, we've done exhibits related to building material types or other aspects of Portland history, with the buildings and the artifacts sort of being the focus. But in this instance, we had these awesome photos with these great details, and we had artifacts to sort of supplement the photos. So it was sort of flipping our usual approach to exhibits on its head. Hugely successful, people were very interested, and I was very happy with that. And it turned out to be our most popular exhibit ever. And I wish it was still open, because we still get people interested. So the house photos in particular are where we have most of the artifacts. Unfortunately, as Ken sort of alluded to, a lot of the Front Avenue buildings were being torn down or just about to be torn down when Minor White took the photos in the late 30s, early 40s. And so that was before people were salvaging from these buildings, and so not a lot of the cast iron pieces and so forth survived, with a few exceptions. You can come to the Architectural Heritage Center, and in our lobby are a couple of pieces from a building called the Cam Block that actually stood until, it survived until 1949. And we have a couple of pieces from that sort of on permanent display in our lobby there, and it's an amazing thing to see every day. I come to work and I see these things and I'm just like blown away. So I recommend, if you haven't come seen those, to at least come into our lobby and take a look. But a lot of the earlier pieces from the commercial buildings didn't survive, but the houses, we were super fortunate. A couple of things. There's two photos on the right in this that are from the Lindley House, or the Knapp House. And this is like one of the smallest rooms in the house, and this is one wall, and it's almost 12, this section is almost 12 feet tall. It was just amazing for us to construct in this room, and I told this story just the other day, how we were getting ready to assemble this exhibit and realized that the Architectural Heritage Center, our main exhibit space, we have 14-foot tall ceilings. We thought we could put this whole wall together, right? It's taller, the room was taller than our huge sort of storefront building space, so we couldn't actually install the entire space, or all the trim that we actually have. And in this particular instance, we were fortunate that when that house was torn down in 1951, it was really well documented. There was a whole sort of an estate sale of pieces from the house, and people were able to come in and bid on basically whole rooms full of wood, trim and so forth. And so some people acquired a bunch of that, and about 50 odd years later, they donated it to the Architectural Heritage Center. So we were fortunate to actually have all this stuff, and all we had to do was basically dust it off and, like with a wet cloth, sort of lightly clean it up, and it's 1880s wood. It's absolutely an amazing condition. So we were able to do that and match it up again with Minor White's photos, and with the stained glass window. This is actually from the turret in the house. And I was really excited because Minor White took an actual photo out the window, looking out that window, so we actually have that window. So that was a pretty amazing moment when we were able to sort of put those two together. So this was just, a great, for us at the Architectural Heritage Center, this was like the first time we were able to actually work together with other institutions locally and really put together something that I think was really dynamic and that really engaged a lot of people and really brought a lot of attention to our organization. That was, having been there 10 years, I was like, I know we're doing good work, and it's like finally we connected. So it was a really good thing and powerful thing, and I'm thankful to all these guys here for helping us make that happen. So thank you.
And see some of the things that we've attempted to do here with the Minor White Archive in Princeton. First, I'd like to just say thank you to Julia and to Charles and everyone who made this possible. This has been just so fascinating for me this morning. And just following up on Val's last comment, collaboration is really what's driving a lot of the interest that we have in the work that we're doing with the Minor White Archive at Princeton. As you can see, the Princeton University Art Museum holds the bulk of Minor White's photographs and professional archive. It was entrusted by the artist after his death in 1976, and in the early 1980s, the materials were generally organized by Peter Bonnell, whom you've probably heard mentioned here a couple of times this morning, into a photography department storeroom, the Minor White Archive Room, as it was known for many, many years, with a 2-page description of a finding aid, I will be a little more fair than that. There were some inventories, the negatives, which, as you can see, number, first of all, the paper archives, over 50 boxes of paper archives, including the artist's memoirs, memorable fancies, which you've heard mentioned this morning, unpublished mock-ups for Aperture magazine, correspondence, his exhibition work, his teaching notes, just endless amounts of correspondence. Nearly 19,000 of Minor White's negatives are in the Princeton University Art Museum archive. These, fortunately, were processed to a very large degree by Peter Bonnell in the 1980s, and we do have the artist's negative numbers assigned to these negatives. An important point for working with Minor White is that he did, in fact, number his photographs, every one of them, we hope. Every once in a while, he numbered more than one of them in the same way, but not that often, honestly. It is the core of how we organize this material, and without it, I think we would really be floundering. So, we also have over 18,000 proof prints and finished prints in the Minor White archive, and 5,544 proof cards where Minor did contact prints from the negatives with his own notes, titles, dates, and instructions for developing those particular images. So that's just to give you a bit of a sense of what's in the Minor White archive. When I first came to Princeton in 2005, I was told that we had the Minor White archive, that everything Minor White ever did was in Princeton, which in fact turned out not to be true. And when we started processing the archive, we were going through all of these proof cards that I mention here. There are blank cards in our files for all of the negatives that are in the Oregon Historical Society and all of the negatives that are in the California Historical Society. They have numbers, we have no image, but anyway, this was the big effort that Peter Bonnell made to try to pull together the whole body of Minor White's work in the Princeton archive. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what we've done so far, which is why I'm standing here at the podium. With the generous support of the Institute of the Museum and Library Services about 4 years ago, we were funded to do a digitization and cataloging project for over 6,000 finished prints in the Minor White archive. And to publish those, which we did, in the Minor White archive website. So I'm not sure if many of you have seen this. I think everyone on the panel has probably visited this site. We're fairly proud of it, although we're very eager to say that this is just the beginning of what needs to be done. We have here, as I said, published some 6,000 images, prints I'm talking about, and in many cases, they're associated proof cards, so that when I look at images that we hold, these are finished prints that are in the Princeton University Art Museum collection now, because all of these prints have been accessioned into the museum collection. Ooh, you don't see this. Let me see if I can jump out. Yeah, I checked it this morning and it was fine, but now it's not fine. That figures. I'll just jump. Nope, I'm not getting out of this slide. Ta-da. So this is a query on the keyword Portland. These are images in the Minor White archive from Minor's years in Portland, as you can see. And it will be interesting to look and see, this is one of those images that we discussed earlier where the negative will be here and not in Princeton because we have no proof print, no proof card for this image. We do in fact have the negative number, which is, as Julia was pointing out earlier, a separate number from our accession number for the object itself, for the print itself. Moving along a little bit further, I'm hoping to find a photograph here that will have a proof card for you. Here's one. So in its entirety, the material that we've put in online includes digital versions of these proof cards. As you can see, there are notes on the front and the back in Miner's hand. They're organized by the negative number. And in addition, we include all published titles that we are aware of for these prints. Again, something that becomes really tricky when you're trying to do research on minor white, because lots of people have photographs. Lots of people call them different things, and they've been published differently over the years. So one of the goals of the archive is to try to compile all of these different published sources so that scholars will be able to be sure that they're finding the work that they think they're looking at. And then in addition, obviously, we have any kind of inscriptions and marks that are on the photographs themselves. So this is about the scope of what we're publishing now on the website. But what we'd like to be able to do is to include the over 18,000 negatives, which have since been scanned. Let me see if I can get back to my, yay. PowerPoint. So what we're hoping to do, our ongoing work and goals for the Minor White Archive include the current 2-year term of a cataloger in the Minor White Archive who has in fact processed, inventoried, and is cataloging the probably in excess of 7,000 unnumbered finished prints in the Minor White Archive. Those are being reconciled back to the negatives and so are being cross-referenced with the negative numbers. We are planning a summer 2018 internship to create a finding aid to the paper archive. This is our big, huge goal. We're hoping that this will make life for all of our visiting fellows a whole lot easier. And we're putting great hope and faith in our summer intern, who has great experience in photography archives. We have hope to digitize critical elements of the paper archive, some of which has been made much more clear to me just today by seeing the kinds of things that all of you are looking for when you come to do research in the Minor White Archive, and obviously from the research visits, which have been increasingly frequent over the last 4 years, and which is a wonderful thing because every time research is done in the archive, we learn more about the material that we have. And then, of course, we would like to make the Minor White Archive website really be a platform, a portal to all of Minor White's work. We're currently upgrading our technology to allow for the contribution of digital resources from other repositories of Minor White material, and we are hoping, of course, to collaborate with all of the other repositories of Minor White materials in order to make that possible. Collaboration being, as I said, our greatest goal, and so thank you. This is what we've been up to at Princeton.
Thank you so much to everyone. We are right on time. It's noon, bumping up against the lunch hour, but does anybody have any questions for any members of the panel before we do break for lunch? We will be reconvening if you are available at 1:30 for our next set of talks. Tom, and microphone's coming right for you right now.
Thank you. I'm compiling a list of Minor White workshops, dates and locations, all of the Oregon workshops. Anybody else working on that?
I know. It's so helpful, to know that you're doing that, because I've always heard about it from people like Bill Galen or people who are involved with camera work gallery here and so on. But it was amazing. I've never, for the most part, seen paperwork, and we have almost nothing in our archives. They have, I would say, at least a full box, if not more. The amount of information that the Princeton archive has is unbelievable. It's everything. It's letters back and forth with Jerry Robinson and all of the players who were involved in putting the government, the state of Oregon governmental notes and requesting Miner to start doing the workshop, and then the art museum school taking over. The archive is unreal. It has everything. It's fantastic.
Are you getting Jerry's papers?
Whose papers?
Jerry Robinson's
Jerry
paper.
Robinson, not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
Yeah, we're. It's interesting for us, and this is something that oftentimes people will reach out to us in terms of archives. We are a fine art museum, so our ability to host archives is very limited. And there are sometimes better places for particular archives, and in particular, we've been talking about negatives. Negatives are very problematic because of the type of care that they need, the type of room that they take, and their purposes. So for the most part, and I'm not necessarily saying that Jerry's archive has negatives, I don't know, but for the most part, we're not set up to take negatives, and we do have some, and we have accessitioned the negatives that Miner made specifically for the museum, but that's a very particular case. We don't have the structure to do perhaps what an institution like Princeton does that has a larger library system can do. So, or OHS or University of Oregon is an example where larger archives can go as well.
I will just only add that the museum at Princeton manages the Miner White Archive, and this is a huge challenge for us. We're not, again, built to be an archive or a library, and so we are, even as we speak, developing methodologies for recording and keeping connected yet separate these individual pieces of the photographic process, which is very challenging in an art museum record-keeping framework. And so it's an ongoing effort to try to find the best way to do that that will also be transparent for researchers.
I think as you can see, though, that we all do care so much about these objects, and they are critical to our understanding of Miner. And even 40 years after his death, we're still trying to piece together facts and ideas. And so keeping all of these things together and then working together and then pushing information online, which oftentimes will bring information back to us, is really critical to stewarding this information in these archives. There was a hand up.
Hi, my name is Joan. Thank you. I have an archival question. You had mentioned that it's really important to have a unique number for every object. And then you had mentioned that what was wonderful about this collection, about White's collection, was that there was a unique number with every, and you used the term photograph. And then later you said that, but we have a bunch of prints that have nothing on them, and you're now in the process of cross-referencing those prints with those negatives. So I would imagine when you said photograph, you meant negatives had all been numbered with unique numbers?
Yes.
Yes.
Well, yes, I was referring to the fact that Miner White assigned a particular number to every photograph he took, which then became a negative and very likely multiple prints.
And so all the multiple prints that you're now working with at different time periods, those will all be cross-referenced with that original negative number in your, and the public will be able to follow that through on.
That's the goal, yes.
Fabulous.
That's the challenge, yes.
Fabulous. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yes, 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 yes. In the website that I showed earlier, there are some 4,500 unique compositions, unique images. But there are 6,000 separate prints, so there are multiple prints in our collection, of course, and then there are many others all around the world.
One of the great things too about the negatives in the numbering system is, unlike the prints, which were the ones that were chosen to be printed and then sort of maybe put out of order or ended up somewhere else, the negatives are in chronological order, and then they're numbered pretty much sequentially as well. And he had several numbering systems, but usually the year was always included, and then there was a numeric sequence like 38-1, 38-50, etc. And on some of the aperture cards, when he went back later, he actually wrote like 38-1, 38-15, he wrote like what date the photo was of the Cam House, which helped me sort of put those numeric ones into order, give a date to them. And then later on, he adopted a system that actually was a 6-digit representation of the year, month, and day, and then the number of the frame that he took. So in many cases, you can look at and compare those and see, well, OHS has a negative that Princeton has a print of, or Princeton has the next 2 or 3 negatives in the sequence, and then sort of vice versa. And some of the WPA prints also have varying levels of specificity in that regard, which really helps you sort of tie it all together from a archival control standpoint, and also the informational value that's in them.
Photographers, keep your negatives tidy, please. It really helps if any of your work comes to an institution. It helps us immensely. Here we are, like I said, here we are 40 years after his death, still putting the puzzle pieces together. And he was so wonderful about the information that he added to his negatives.
Yeah, the other thing I wanted to mention quickly too that I forgot to say is the WPA hired him. He was doing government work and creating this narrative of historic Portland, but the WPA also was partially funding the demolition of the buildings along Front Avenue to create Harbor Drive. So in one case, the art project director sent a letter to the Commissioner of Public Works, who was also involved in that, and sent him a copy of the iconic view of Front Avenue from the Burnside Bridge, and said, we're thinking about doing a painting of this photograph for your office. Would you be interested in doing that? And so it's interesting to see the historic context kind of play out versus the creative work.
Well, I think we all might be a little bit hungry. We will reconvene. Hopefully you are available at 1:30. And with your P sticker, you are welcome to look at any exhibition in the museum today. But we would love for you to also go up and visit the Minor White if you haven't yet already, just out the hall to the left and upstairs. Thanks, everyone.